In Yellowstone National Park, there's a body of water called Mammoth Hot Springs. These hot springs are far too hot for humans to relax in, but they are perfectly comfortable for a wide diversity of thermophilic bacteria. These bacteria, and this whole hot springs site in general, are hotspots for microbial research in all of its glorious applications, from microbial evolution and niche specialization to physiological and geochemical properties that might hold clues for astrobiology. One of these bacteria, which is really common in Mammoth Hot Springs, is the Aquaficles bacterium Sulfurahydrogenibium yellowstonensis, also called sulfuri for short, and I'll be calling it sulfuri because it's way easier to say than its actual scientific name. So this sulfuri bacteria is evolutionarily ancient, and it's perfectly happy to live in habitats that are extreme on Earth, but that may be more temperate or normal in one respect or another on different planets, be they in another solar system or in our backyard, like on Mars. So I'll explain how this ties into Mars, but it'll be somewhat of a roundabout journey, the scenic route, if you will. Bruce Folk is a geology professor at the University of Illinois, who led the research on this particular bacterium. He explained that its lineage originated more than 2.3 billion years ago, when life was still extremely primitive and relatively young. This bacteria has the ability to resist UV radiation, and it prefers very little exposure to oxygen, as it consumes sulfur and CO2 for energy, and exposure to oxygen can, in many cases, denature the enzymes that it uses for its sulfur and CO2 metabolism. In the hot, flowing water of Mammoth Hot Springs, the sulfuri bacteria take on an interesting form. Now, we all know that groups of bacteria growing together can form microbial mats, which can generate complex internal nutrient-sharing and sediment-depositing ecologies that exist between the various layers of the microbes. There's another bacterial structure that's formed called a stromatolite. But these microbial mats are just that. They're mats. They're flat sheets of slimy goo, built from layers of microbes just growing on top of each other. The sulfuri don't do this. Instead of forming literal mats, in hot flowing water they'll bind end to end, creating long filamentous strands of bacteria that flap and wave around in the water current. Dr. Folk described this as the bacteria hanging on for dear life. But in a more technical explanation, he said, quote, "They form tightly wound cables that wave like a flag that's fixed on one end," unquote. What's kind of neat is that these bacterial chains secrete chemicals that make them slimy and slippery, preventing other microbes from attaching to them. Their chaotic flapping in the water current is also a mechanical barrier that prevents pathogens from being able to stably attach to them. When Dr. Folk's research team took samples of these bacteria from Mammoth Hot Springs and analyzed the genes being used in the bacteria's metabolism, they deciphered what they eat and how they use it. They confirmed that these microbes derive energy from reduced sulfur, like sulfide and thiosulfate, and they fix CO2 to derive the raw carbon atom, which is used for growth and enzyme maintenance and energy storage and whatever else they need to use the carbon atom for. Alright, now here is where things get cool. So there are some proteins and assorted chemicals on the cell surface of these bacteria, and these chemicals and proteins interact with calcium carbonate, or CaCO3, to create a limestone called travertine. The travertine encases and entombs the flapping strands of sulfuri bacteria, starting at the base and crystallizing outwards towards the tip. This crystallization reaction is actually really rapid and really intense, in no small part because of the high heat catalyzing the reaction, and the abundance of calcium carbonate to supply material for the crystallization. Up to 5 millimeters of encasing travertine can be crystallized in a single day, which is a crazy fast buildup. This accumulation of travertine encasing the bacterial filaments does two major things. First, by encasing these filaments, it creates little ridges, called streamers, that trace along the long, flowing filamentous forms of the microbial cables. This lifts up the biological material off the bed of the hot spring, separating it physically from other microbes, and putting it in a slightly altered chemical environment with less obnoxious oxygen to denature its enzymes. The second thing this does is that it eventually will produce pseudofossils, or rock formations that trace and delineate the structure of the microbial colony underneath. The long, flowing spaghetti strands basically ossify into the rock, which does a really good job at preserving the evidence of this biological structure. Now we get to the part where Mars comes in. What the researchers have basically described here is a very characteristic and identifiable biosignature. If we were to find similar spaghetti-like rock formations on Mars, especially somewhere where we have evidence that suggests that it used to be wet and or maybe even volcanic, this would be extremely strong evidence for ancient microbial Martian life. Dr. Folk explains, quote, "This should be an easy form of fossilized life for a rover to detect on other planets. If we see the deposition of this kind of extensive filamentous rock on other planets, we would know it's a fingerprint of life. It's big and unique. No other rocks look like this. It would be definitive evidence of the presence of alien microbes." Unquote.